Good afternoon and welcome to the sixth session of the 53rd FINEX Annual Conference. The theme of this session is a glimpse into the future, planning for the present. May I now call back our MC for today, Mr. John Balse.
Good afternoon, my fellow FINEX members and guests. Welcome to the sixth session of the 53rd Annual FINEX Week Conference. The theme of this year's conference is Inclusive Disruption, Achieving a Sustainable Future in the New Frontier. This year, we have rolled out a series of webinars involving prestigious speakers discussing thought-provoking topics that are relevant in the current environment. Our sixth session for this year's FINEX Week will focus on the topic, A Glimpse into the Future, Planning for the Present. Our speaker will share with us her experience on how their vision of the future has been affected by the constantly changing global environment and how they are coping with this through effective planning. We are delighted to have with us this afternoon Ms. Malika Ishwaran, Chief Economist of Royal Dutch Shell. She advises on economic, energy, and climate policies to shape Shell's long-term scenarios. She leads strategic engagements on energy transitions with national and city governments across the world, notably a multi-year collaboration with the Chinese government. Malika also helps shape Shell's policy and advocacy on the energy transition to support the company's decarbonization strategy. She sits on a range of external advisory boards. Before joining Shell, she was Deputy Director at the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, responsible for evidence and analysis across the environment, food, and green economy portfolio. She has held senior positions in the UK government, including at the Cabinet Office as Head of Policy Analysis for the 2009 G20 London Summit. Before that, Malika worked in senior economics and policy roles in the USA. Malika holds PhD and MS degrees in economics from Carnegie Mellon University in the US and a BA from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, India. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Ms. Malika Ishwaran.
Great. Many thanks for that introduction. It's a long time since I've heard the full bio being read out, but thank you very much and it's a real pleasure to be here and to share some of the thinking that we are doing within Shell to think through the energy transition and how Shell will navigate its way through the energy transition. It speaks very much to the topic for this section of planning for the future. So scenarios. So I'm part of the scenarios team within Shell, and we've been doing scenarios in Shell for over 50 years. And this is a way of helping the company make better decisions in the face of large and systemic uncertainties. Now, what we see today with the energy transition very much fits within that. And we use our scenarios approach to think through different sort of pathways that the energy transition might take. And then from that, discern what are the sensible opportunities as well as challenges that the company faces, navigating its way through the transition. So what I'd like to do is firstly spend a little time talking about why we use scenarios in Shell, go on to thinking about COVID and what that has done and the sort of the disruption that has caused in the global economy, and then sort of lead into the sort of our long-term scenarios, the energy transformation scenarios, and sort of end with a short sort of discussion around how Shell's strategy as a result has evolved in response to these opportunities and challenges. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So yes, so I just to say that we are talking about long-term outlooks and changes, but just to be very clear that the scenarios are not forecasts, firstly, and they are certainly not to be taken as business plans for Shell and for as a basis of investment decisions. So before I move on, it's worth flagging that, and so that when listening to this presentation, you bear that in mind. If we move to the next slide, please. So why scenarios? So again, as I said, we've been doing scenarios at Shell for over 50 years. And again, the idea there is to stretch the mindsets of our senior decision makers so that as a result of these uncertainties, we're still able to make better informed decisions. So if you assume that there's no uncertainty in the world, then it's a fairly straightforward exercise to look at the drivers of change, look at today, and then to put that together to get a reasonably good view of what the future might look like. You might have some uncertainties that do play in, and in many cases you could do sensitivities around these forecasts and get again a reasonably good view of what the future might look like. But the world we live in is much more complex than that. You have multiple drivers and multiple lenses with which you can view the situation today. For example, you could look at the world today through the economic growth lens. You could look at it through the energy supply lens, or you could look at it through the environmental lens. Now, each of these sort of drivers will evolve over time, and not just on their own, but they'll also interact with each other as they evolve. For example, the high economic growth, it will result in greater energy demand. But having environmental considerations play in means that the energy supply or the energy mix used to meet that demand might be quite different. So again, what scenarios do is help put our arms around and put some structure around these deep and systemic uncertainties to develop a range of future worlds, a range of what the future might look like in a way that's internally consistent and robust. Again, what that does is help decisions to consider the full range of possibilities and outcomes and make decisions on the basis of all that, the full range of knowledge. So again, it's really an exercise to help us think through all the possible outcomes and sort of factor them in to the decisions that as a company we're making. If you move to the next slide. So we're talking about COVID, and again, it's a huge disruptor to the global economy, and not just as a result of the health effects of the COVID-19 virus, but also as a result of the measures that have been taken to control the spread of the virus. And that's caused a massive disruption, not just in the global economy, but also in societies across the world. And so again, it's a real moment for us to consider what changes or what sort of permanent trends this might then kick off as a result following the COVID pandemic. And again, as I said, this has affected not just the economic system, it's affected energy supply, it's affected our climate outcomes. And so, it's a starting point for our thinking about the scenarios going forward. Now, if you go to the next slide. So last year, towards the end of last year, we released short-term scenarios. So we looked at what the COVID-19 pandemic means for the world in the 2020s, so in this decade. We looked at what sort of the recovery or the coming out of the pandemic might look like. And the three scenarios we came up with were wealth, security, and health first. Now, each of these scenarios prioritizes a different aspect of recovering or coming out of the pandemic. Now, all societies will want some element of wealth, security, and health when coming out of this pandemic. But what these scenarios explore is the prioritization of one of these factors over the other as countries recover. So if I take the wealth scenario, this is a scenario where countries prioritize economic recovery. So reopening the economy is a priority. And again, what this does is, while it does get economic growth going in the near term, it's a bumpy recovery. So the downside of this wealth scenario is that the recovery is not smooth, and that's because the pandemic continues, and there are measures taken at intervals to control outbreaks and spikes in infection that might result. But the priority is to reopen the economy and to get economic recovery going. Now, if you look at the security first scenario, that is a scenario where the priority is to get back the sense of security and self-sufficiency. So again, we've seen this in response to the pandemic to sort of retreat and to drive a more nationalistic and a more security first national security agenda. And again, the downside of this type of an approach is that you lose the gains that the world has received from globalization for the last 30, 40 years. So again, it creates short-term stability, but in the longer term, it has an economic cost through the loss of globalization benefits. Now, the third scenario we've looked at is health first. And this is where governments prioritize the improvement in health and well-being. So again, this is a world where the priority is not reopening the economy, but it's about reopening the economy in a safe way. So again, on the plus side, once economic recovery in health takes hold, it is sustainable, it's not bumpy, and you have a much smoother path in terms of the economic recovery following it. But this is also a scenario where it takes a little bit longer for the economic recovery to happen, because the priority is to ensure that the health effects of the pandemic are first dealt with before the economy is reopened. So again, all of these three scenarios explore different aspects of the choices facing government. And again, it's worth bearing in mind that no one scenario is better than the other. They all have positives as well as downsides to them, but they cover in our view, the range of options in terms of how governments might respond and how economies might recover from the pandemic. Now, each of these scenarios has different implications in terms of course, as I said, economic growth. Has different implications in terms of energy demand as a result of the different underlying economic growth, has different implications in terms of technology development and progress on the energy transition, and hence different implications for the addressing the issue of climate change. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. So this decade and the COVID pandemic was a starting point for thinking about our longer term scenarios, which are the energy transformation scenarios. So these are long-term global scenarios that look out deep into this century to understand what the changes in the energy system might look like under different circumstances, and what that would mean in turn for the energy system and for the issue of climate change. Now, the three scenarios were released earlier this year in February, and they're Waves, Islands, and Sky 1.5. As you can see from the slide, they take the starting point of our short-term scenarios. So Waves starts from a wealth first position. So it starts from an economic recovery being a priority position. Island starts from a security first position. So again, it's where economies are prioritizing self-sufficiency and security. And then we play that out over the course of this century to see what that would mean in terms of energy transformation. And Sky 1.5 is our health first scenario. So again, it takes the starting point of a much more measured approach to reopening following the pandemic. And then we play that out in terms of what it means for the energy transformation. So what I'll do is go through each of these scenarios very briefly, so you get a flavor of how this plays out over the course of the next few decades. So if you go to the next slide. So picking up on Waves. So again, as I said, it's a wealth first scenario. So it's a scenario where the priority is economic recovery, and it is about getting this recovery going as soon as possible. So what this means essentially is that the structural problems that existed in the global economy before the pandemic whether that's around issues of addressing climate change, or it's around issues of inequality or public health. These structural issues are not addressed in the coming out of the pandemic. So pretty much the focus is on getting economic recovery going in the same patterns as it had before the pandemic. So the structural issues that plagued the global economy before the pandemic continue in this scenario as we move beyond that. So what that means is there's a surge in energy use and emissions as energy demand and energy supply patterns revert back to what they were pre-pandemic. So again, we are seeing that, and there's a surge in sort of a reversion towards what was the case before the pandemic. Now, because the structural issues are not addressed in this particular scenario, we have over the course of over this decade and the next decade, growing inequality. So the inequalities we see today continue to diverge and continue to be disruptive. We also see climate change not being a priority in this world, and so again, the impact of that is seen through frequent and extreme weather events happening over the course of the next 2 decades. As a result of this building up of these pressures, structural pressures, we find that there's an intensification of social pressures around these structural issues, and towards the end of the 2030s, there's a backlash that forces policymakers to start getting their act together and addressing the issue of climate change in particular. So again, towards the late 2030s, we have this backlash, and this is followed by rapid activity, policy, business, and societal activity to address the issue of climate change. So again, it's a late but fast decarbonization that we envision in this scenario. In terms of the climate outcome, the temperature rise is limited to 2.3 centigrade above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. So again, this is higher than the agreement than what was set out in the Paris Agreement, and certainly higher than the stretch goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to stabilize temperatures at 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, if you go to the next slide. So islands is the next scenario. And again, the starting point here is the security first scenario. So it's focused very much on self-sufficiency, on nationalism. And so again, here you see a retreat from global globalization, as well as in terms of trade, as well as in terms of global collaboration through international platforms. So again, you have a restriction of that activity, much more sort of retreating inwards. As a result of this, you have the economic growth stagnating. So again, the loss of globalization, the readjustment of supply chains, all of this sort of has a knock-on effect on growth. And as a result of that, energy demand in this particular scenario is also moderated. So growth is lower, and so is energy demand. Now, there is some action on climate change to the extent it fits with the security first agenda. So to the extent that shifting to renewables and deploying renewables helps increase energy security, this scenario does involve that kind of action on climate technologies and their deployment, but it's nowhere near enough to meet the goals of what the Paris Agreement has set out. So again, this is a scenario where there is slow progress towards it's late and slow decarbonization. And we have temperature rise in this particular scenario reaching 2.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels by 2100, and still rising. So we still haven't in this world action to reverse the effects of climate change haven't yet taken hold. So if we go to the third scenario, in the next slide, please. So the third scenario is our Sky 1.5 scenario. Now, again, the starting point here is health first. So again, well-being is the priority. So this is the world in which the post-pandemic recovery is seen as an opportunity to address some of the structural issues in the global economy before the pandemic hit. So there is a focus on getting more equity and equality addressed as the recovery takes hold, there is a focus on coordination around public health globally to address and put the world in a better position for these type of pandemic events. And there is a sort of collaboration around the issue of climate change and the urgency to address the issue. So again, the economy opens cautiously, but it opens steadily. And there's a lot of deliberate intent in terms of policy, business, and societal action to ensure that the structural issues are addressed. Now, there is a recognition here in the value of alignment. So this is a world where global collaboration continues to be the priority. And also, this is a world in which the green or investment in a low carbon becomes a priority. So this is also a world, for example, where you would see a focus on green recovery, for example. So, the recovery packages that governments are providing their economies are focused and have a slant towards supporting green. So again, this is a green recovery scenario. The structural changes that are then put in as a result mean that this is a scenario where growth does come back. It is a prosperous world, but comes back in a way that has lower emissions. So that's sort of an important distinction, for example, with waves. So in terms of temperature rise, this is a world where global temperatures rise 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. So again, this is consistent, and this is one scenario that's consistent with the stretch goals of the Paris Agreement, not the 2.5, well below 2.5, but actually close to 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise. So if you go to the next slide. So I've given you sort of a flavor of what the drivers, if you like, in terms of economic, societal, as well as energy, technology, and energy supply in each of the three scenarios, which are quite different as they play out. Now, some of the commonalities, and to compare what the energy system in particular looks like under each of these scenarios, this slide sets out what is energy demand in each of the three scenarios. So you have waves, sky, and islands there. Waves has the highest energy demand because, again, this is a scenario where recovery is prioritized, so it starts immediately, and structural change in terms of the shift towards lower carbon and lower emissions doesn't really take until much later in the scenario time frame. So you have a much higher energy demand scenario. Now, sky is the middle one, where you have sort of growth takes a little longer, but you also have longer to establish, but you also have structural changes that drive energy efficiency and lower emissions. And of course, islands is the lowest energy demand scenario because this is also the lowest economic growth scenario. So this is the scenario where the global economy pretty much stagnates, and as a result of that, the energy demand also stagnates. If we move to the next slide, please. Great. And so this is, again, the total final energy consumption and broken out by the OECD, or the developed world, and non-OECD, the emerging and developing world. So the lower blue band gives you the range of outcomes in sky, waves, and islands for the OECD countries. So again, here you see total final consumption of energy in the OECD world, the blue world, is pretty much flat in all of the three scenarios. So again, that's a common point. As these countries have sort of reached saturation in terms of their population growth, as well as in terms of rising standards of living. Now, the red band on top is the non-OECD world, and this is where most of the growth, if not all of the growth in energy total final consumption is going to come from. So again, the band gives you the range of final consumption across waves, islands, and sky 1.5. And again, much of this growth in energy consumption is as a result of the growth in population in these parts of the world, as well as the really strong rising standards of living that we are likely to see across the world. So again, quite a dichotomy in terms of how energy demand is going to play out between the OECD and the non-OECD. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, one of the other things that we talk a lot about in the context of energy transformation and energy transition is the role of electrification. So most of deep decarbonization scenarios that look at sort of the world tackling climate change consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement have electrification as the backbone of the scenario. So again, I thought it'd be useful to put up for the three scenarios what we see in terms of the trends in electrification. So again, a little bit of a historical context. So if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, that shows you the increase in electrification over the last 40 years. So again, we've seen sort of a steady increase of about 2.3 percentage points per decade in terms of the increase in electrification over the last 4 decades. And today we have about 20% of energy demand is electrified. Now, if you look at the right-hand side of the chart, we're looking at post-2020. The levels of electrification for the next 40 years. So again, the top line here is Sky 1.5. And again, you see the sort of quite sharp, massive increase in electrification that we see in Sky 1.5. Again, here you see electricity accounting for almost at 50% of total energy demand. So from today's 20%, rising up to 50% of energy demand being electrified. Now that is the ramp up, almost threefold, more than threefold ramp up in the rate of electrification per decade that we've seen in the last 4 decades. So a real increase in the scale and effort around electrification in Sky 1.5. You see a sort of a similar trend in both waves and islands, but to a lesser extent. And again, this is because Sky 1.5 assumes collaboration and sort of cohesion across and within economies, and that helps drive that level of electrification. In waves, you have less of that agreement and alignment around addressing structural issues. So while electrification does increase, it doesn't do so at the pace you see in Sky. And again, islands is a much more insular world, so you have current trends continuing rather than any sort of major change from what's happened in the last 4 decades. If you go to the next slide. Now, electrification is great, but how that electricity demand is met becomes very crucial. So electrification with low carbon electrons, as we call them, or through renewables is absolutely critical. So you have the share of electricity in energy demand going up to 50%. But at the same time, what you have is a decline or flattening out of the role of non-renewables or fossil fuels in meeting that electricity demand. So the dark blue sort of bar in this chart, the lower bar, is the range of non-renewable electricity that's been generated. So again, you see that that's pretty much flat and declining across all the 3 scenarios, waves, islands, and Sky 1.5. Now, if you look at the lighter blue band on the top, that is the growth in renewable sources of electricity generation. So again, across all 3 scenarios, there's a massive ramp up in renewable generation to meet the rising energy demand. The top of the range obviously is Sky 1.5, where renewables have the maximum deployment, and the bottom of the range is islands, where renewables and other low carbon sources are deployed as long as they align with the domestic energy security agenda. If you go to the next slide. So here's sort of what the picture looks like for oil and gas demand. Now, as you notice, the keen ones would have noticed that we have electrification rising to be around 50% of energy demand. What that means is that the remaining 50% of energy demand will continue to require molecules. So electrons will not be adequate to meet the energy needs in sectors like aviation, in heavy industry, which require thermal heat. And so again, for these kind of sectors, molecules remain important. But the nature of the molecules that are used to meet the energy needs of these sectors changes dramatically. So if you look at the left-hand chart, that's liquid fuels demand. And the red bar there is fossil fuels, oil demand. Now, again, in all the 3 scenarios, you see that oil demand peaks in the next few decades and then declines pretty substantially. And that's driven by the electrification of sectors like road transport with the incoming of electric vehicles. Now, some of this demand for liquid fuels that declines is made up for by the increase in the green band you see at the bottom, and that's around advanced biofuels. So we see sectors like aviation continuing to require sort of liquid fuels, and instead of oil, we see a shift in those sectors towards advanced biofuels to meet the needs. So again, you see structurally, though, overall, the amount of demand for liquid fuels falls. And also at the same time, you're seeing a substitution of some of that demand towards biofuels or more sustainable sources of molecules. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, that's the story around gas. So again, the red bar sort of shows you the outcomes in waves, islands, and Sky 1.5 for natural gas. So again, similar pattern to oil. We find that we think that natural gas across all the three scenarios will peak and then decline over the course of this century. But again, here what's different is that demand for gaseous molecules, though, we see that rising sharply, and that's what you see in the green band. So this green band reflects hydrogen. So you see a decline in the role of natural gas and being substituted by hydrogen in many of the uses that gas currently meets. But also, there's a trend increase in the role of gaseous fuels, low carbon fuels like hydrogen. And you see that across all the three scenarios. Now, the top end of the range of the green band, of course, is Sky 1.5, where you have the greatest deployment of hydrogen of the three scenarios. If you go to the next slide. So here's something, so hopefully that gave a flavor of some of the changes that we see and some of the consistencies across the three scenarios in terms of energy system impacts. So the three scenarios are quite different in terms of the economic, societal, and technological outlooks. But despite that, there are certain commonalities that we are seeing across them in terms of the energy system transformation. And what this chart is looking at is that change and so highlighting the commonalities that we see. So the chart itself refers to Sky 1.5, and this looks at total final energy consumption in the Sky 1.5 scenario and how that energy demand or energy consumption is being met. So again, the 5 things I would like to highlight in terms of being common across the three scenarios is firstly that energy demand or energy needs are growing, as is energy efficiency across all the three scenarios. So again, energy needs are growing because of increases in population, as well as rising standards of living, particularly in the non-OECD countries. But at the same time, you're seeing massive increases in energy efficiency across the world that moderate some of this increase in energy demand. Now, in terms of the chart on the right, if you look at the dotted line on the top, that's the energy demand growth that we expect without those energy efficiency improvements. And so you can see the gap between that dotted line right at the top and the sort of solid bars below, and that's the impact of energy efficiency improvements, and not the least through electrification on reducing the levels of total final consumption. And again, this is consistent across all the three scenarios. The second point is around deep electrification from renewable sources. And again, you see that across the three scenarios, and in the context of this chart, the light blue bar that's coming through, that is the increase in electrification and an increase in electrification with renewables. Again, common across the three scenarios. While there is an increase in electrification, the need for molecules remains, particularly in the hard to electrify sectors that I mentioned, like aviation and heavy industry. So what we see here is that liquid fuels demand, which is the red and the pink bars on the chart, are increasingly, you find oil being replaced by biofuel in terms of liquid fuels. And you find in terms of gaseous fuels, natural gas being replaced by hydrogen. So again, so that's common across all the three scenarios. The fourth commonality is that oil and gas remain in the energy system as it transitions. So again, there's a role for but it's a declining role that we expect. It holds true across the three scenarios. And so this, and over time, you'd have it transitioning out of the energy system, but during the transition, an important role for oil and natural gas. And for the amount of oil and natural gas that remains in the system in the long term, there is also a role for carbon capture and storage, as well as nature-based solutions. So like afforestation and other sort of solution, natural carbon sinks, to basically account for any remaining fossil fuel emissions from the energy system. So again, these are sort of commonalities that we're seeing across all the different scenarios. If you go to the next slide. So here's sort of the emissions outlook in the three scenarios. As I mentioned, we have Sky is the only scenario that is consistent with the stretch goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, and you see that in the light blue line. Emissions decline is much quicker, happens much sooner, and you move into negative emissions territory in Sky, so that the temperature rise remains consistent with Paris. Waves eventually gets there, so it's a late but fast decarbonization story. So you lose a couple of decades, and then decarbonization happens very fast. And then Islands is the story where, again, emissions are coming down. It's worth noting that, but nowhere near the speed and pace that we require for Paris to meet the Paris goals. If we move to the next slide. So just to reiterate, I think the difference between the three scenarios is speed. So again, in terms of technologies that are required to decarbonize, all the three scenarios rely on a similar set of technologies, whether that's renewable electricity, hydrogen, advanced biofuels, carbon capture and storage. They're all sort of similar suite of technologies across all three scenarios. But the issue is the speed of deployment of these technologies. And obviously Sky is the most accelerated scenario, followed by waves and then by islands. So again, the speed of addressing and deploying these low carbon technologies is a key differentiator between the scenarios. If you go to the next slide. So Shell as a company has committed to being a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. So for us, and we have supported the Paris Climate Agreement. So for us, the interest is in understanding what does it take to accelerate action so that we are in a world of Sky 1.5 rather than waves and islands. So we've looked at action accelerators and the three sort of buckets of action that we've sort of identified. Firstly, the need to get alignment across policies, sectors, and customers. What this means is basically getting alignment with policymakers so that you have policies that set a level playing field between fossil and low carbon energies. You need sectors, you need businesses working together to develop innovative solutions and low carbon products, as well as business models to support those solutions and products. And you also need customers of society creating the demand or the pull for these low carbon products to complement the push from the technology side that businesses are making. So alignments become very sort of important in order to accelerate the pace of change. Now, policy itself is a key driver of change here. So again, the whole issue of climate change is a result of a market failure to price in the damage caused by carbon emissions. So policy is absolutely fundamental and essential to address that market failure. And again, here the role is for smart rules and policies and incentives to harness the market forces and innovation and creativity in the market to then drive change in a way that's more accelerated than would happen otherwise. And then thirdly is the need in this decade for pioneer leaders. These are sort of companies or countries that are ahead of the curve, who are driving the commercialization of low carbon fuels like hydrogen, who are deploying renewables and electricity infrastructure, at a pace at the pace required. And basically, these are the leaders who are getting the ball rolling to give momentum to the change and to demonstrate what the change would look like to then create more followers. So again, there's a very important role for these sort of pioneer leaders. If you go to the next slide. So I'll just touch briefly on Shell strategy. So again, a lot of these thinking that we've done through the scenarios identified differentiators between the scenarios, but more than that, it identified all the common elements that we're seeing across the three scenarios. And as a result of that, that informed our thinking. And in February this year, we had a pivot in our strategy towards becoming a low carbon, a net zero emission business by 2050. And again, you're seeing this sort of activity accelerate across companies. We have more than 1,000 companies that are now committed to net zero by 2050. We're also seeing countries get on this cause, and you see more than 120 countries are setting their national ambitions to get to net zero. Now, at Shell, we want to be one of the pioneer leaders, as I said before, to sort of demonstrating and driving momentum and change. And we're doing this through the energy we provide. So we are looking at how all the sort of energy products that we provide and how can we reduce the emissions intensity of those products. We're also an energy user from our operations around the world. So we're looking at how do we reduce the energy we use to produce the products and energy that we supply. So again, we're looking at that. And the third sort of key pillar is like we're working with folks and with companies in different parts of the value chain, both not just in energy supply, but also in terms of energy demand, to get them to also move with us at the same pace to change the demand for the kinds of energy that are needed towards low carbon. If you go to the next slide. Right. So a little bit more specificity about our target. It's worth noting that our net zero emissions target includes what we call scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scopes 1 and 2 emissions are pretty much emissions that are created as a result of our activities ourselves. So in terms of oil and gas extraction, supply, and also those that we do with our partners and joint ventures. So those seem more obvious in terms of emissions for coming from Shell. But what we've also done is committed to reducing our scope 3 emissions to net zero. And these are emissions coming from the use of our products. So when you gas up your car and drive, the emissions from that would be counted as part of the Shell scope 3 emissions if you gas up at a Shell station. Now, if you look at the sort of pie chart on the left-hand side, you see the gray sliver. That's scope 1 and 2. So it's a tiny part, actually, of the emissions that Shell creates or is taking responsibility for. Almost 90% of our emissions are scope 3 emissions, that is used from the emissions coming from the products that we are selling. So if you look at the right-hand side, our commitment is to not just in 2050 to become net zero, but obviously we have intermediate targets that we've set up for 2023, 2030, as well as 2035 to sort of set out the trajectory for reducing our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions over the course of the next 30 years. If you go to the next slide. So again, as I said, we released our new strategy, which was a real pivot from our previous focus, and very much focused on the low carbon energy transition we think is underway already and is inevitable, and also focusing on how do we accelerate that transition so that we're in more of a Sky 1.5 kind of world that is consistent with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we do have an upstream pillar. So this is our existing oil and gas assets, which we think will be required over the course of the transition. But here we're focusing and prioritizing 9 particular areas which have the best energy and emissions performance within our upstream assets. We're looking at a transition pillar, which is the role of natural gas and chemicals over the course of the transition. We think natural gas is an alternative to coal, particularly or in the near and medium term, while we are transitioning to a even lower carbon system. So again, here that's our transition pillar. And the key focus is around our growth pillar, which is the future of energy. And this is around all the new energies we think around renewables, hydrogen, advanced biofuels, also around new technologies like carbon capture and storage. So again, so that sets out a little bit of more granularity around how we see over the course of the transition, how we see our portfolio evolving over the next 30 years. If you go to the next slide. And this is my last slide, but I would like to sort of conclude on the sort of what's new in making this change. And I think what's really been striking when we were doing our new strategy pivot was the fact that it's not just about supply changing. So it's not just about Shell or energy suppliers changing from oil and gas towards low carbon electricity or hydrogen or biofuels. It is also about changing the demand side of energy. So sectors that use energy, whether that's industry or buildings or transport, you need changes in the technologies in those sectors so that they're able to run off low carbon energy. So you're seeing that change through electric vehicles, but we're not seeing as much of a change, for example, in heavy duty trucks, in changes in terms of their drivetrains towards low carbon. You also need to change, for example, heavy industry. Whether steel is made from natural gas or hydrogen will require different production processes. So again, you need the demand side of this equation also changing. So we're working very closely together, sector by sector, so shipping, aviation, heavy duty truck, power. We're working together with the demand side of the equation to drive this change. So it's not about supply changing and then demand changing. It's about simultaneously driving change in both so that we can accelerate action. It's also working very closely together with policymakers. Because again, you need, at least in the near term, you need enabling policy frameworks that can then help set the scene and then help make the case for business investment and activities to drive change. And I think there's an important element of international coordination here also, as many of these sectors, say aviation or shipping, are global. So again, making the change and accelerating the change does require operating at an international level. And I'll end with an example where we're working with a group called the Clean Skies for Tomorrow initiative here in the EU. And that basically is a grouping that brings together the different players in the aviation value chain. So we have part of the grouping is our fuel suppliers like Shell and Neste. It also includes airports like Heathrow or Schiphol, where who are responsible for the refueling infrastructure. It includes airlines who are responsible for planes and the kinds of fuels those planes are flying on, as well as engine manufacturers that are making engines that hopefully will fly on sustainable aviation fuel. Now, again, the idea of bringing this group together is to cover all the different aspects of the aviation value chain and to drive a common understanding of what is the pathway for decarbonizing the sector and what are the investments that each player needs to make simultaneously in order to accelerate action. And one of the key outcomes of bringing together this group is a common understanding and recommendation to the European Commission to increase the levels of sustainable aviation fuels being blended into aviation fuels to up to 10% by 2030. I don't think that level of ambition, 10% by 2030, would have been achieved by talking to any one player in the value chain. But talking to the group as a whole, sort of unlocked action, simultaneous action, and what's possible. And that's what's needed in order to accelerate action and to accelerate the speed of decarbonization to be consistent with something like a Sky 1.5 scenario. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the panel discussion to come. Again, if you'd like to find out a bit more about our scenarios, then you can follow the link that's up here to go and see all the different products and information and data that we have on the various scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ishwaran, for your very insightful presentation, especially on how scenario thinking has been applied in your organization in light of the desire to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner. Needless to say, we allowed Royal Dutch Shell's commitment to the Paris Climate Accord. As you have demonstrated, scenario thinking is indeed very crucial as we all think about our respective companies' long-term plans. At this point, I would like to introduce our panelists for the panel discussion. Each of them will have 5 to 7 minutes to present their reaction and insights about the topic, which will be followed by an open forum. Similar to our earlier webinars, we would like to encourage our audience to ask questions through the Q&A box found on your Zoom screens. Allow me now to introduce all of our panelists in order of presentation. Our first panelist is Mr. Carlos Bernardo O. Abad Santos. He is the Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning of the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA. He was previously the Director of Governance Staff under the same office. As Assistant Secretary, he has oversight and supervision on planning and policy formulation of the following sector staffs: governance, macroeconomy, social development, and trade, services, and industry. He was Executive Director and Senior Research Fellow of the Asia Pacific Policy Center from 2005 to 2013, where he spearheaded or collaborated on studies relating to poverty, agribusiness development, local governance, and agrarian reform. He likewise worked as independent consultant for several institutions, including the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, Southeast Asian Regional Center for Graduate Study and Research in Agriculture, and Save the Children Federation, Incorporated. Mr. Abad Santos has a master's in economics from the University of the Philippines School of Economics and a diploma in economic development planning from the Instituto de Studi per los Vilupo Economico. Our second panelist, Mr. Christopher Bishuri, is currently the Chief Strategy Officer for Aboitiz Equity Ventures and concomitantly the Chief Strategy Officer for Aboitiz Power. Prior to joining the Aboitiz company at end 2018, Chris was Group President and COO of Vixal Development Corporation, a diversified conglomerate in the Philippines focused on retail, property development, and financial services. Chris has also sat on the boards of publicly traded businesses in the Philippines. Chris was with McKinsey & Company for 16 years, serving clients in Southeast Asia, North Asia, Australia, and headed the Philippines practice for 8 years. He also served as the Chief of Staff for Asia. Before coming to Asia, Chris worked with the US Treasury for 8 years and as an adjunct professor of finance at Georgetown University. He graduated from the Michigan State University, particularly from the James Madison College of Public Policy and Department of Economics, and was a member of the Honors College. He finished his Master's of Public Affairs and Economics at Princeton University. Our third panelist is Mr. Paulo Borromeo. He is a Managing Director of Ayala Corporation and a member of the Ayala Group Management Committee. He heads Ayala Corporation's Corporate Strategy and Development Group, overseeing the group corporate planning process, portfolio strategy, innovation projects, data and analytics, new business development, and special projects. Paulo is also President and CEO of Ayala's healthcare arm, AC Health. He is the Chairman of Healthway Philippines, IE Medica, and MedEthics, QualiMed Hospital Group, and the Vice Chairman of the Generica Group of Companies. He also sits on the board of AC Ventures Holding Corporation, AC Industrial Technology Holdings Incorporated, Ayala International Holdings Limited, and AG Holdings. Paulo is also a director at Yoma Strategic Holdings, the Singapore-listed holding company of the Yoma Group of Myanmar. He obtained his Bachelor of Science degree in Management Engineering from the Ateneo de Manila University and his Master's in Business Administration with honors from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. To facilitate the open forum, may also introduce our moderator, Mr. Jose Jerome R. Pascual III. Mr. Pascual is the former or retired Chief Financial Officer, Vice President, Finance and Treasurer, and Chief Risk Officer of Pilipinas Shell Petroleum Corporation, and former Chairman of the Shell Philippines Pension Funds. He is presently an independent director on the board of the Philippine Dealing System Group and chairs the PDS Audit Committee. He was the 2020 president of the Financial Executives Institute of the Philippines and is currently chairman of the FINEX Research and Development Foundation. He is also president and co-incorporator of the Judicial Reform Initiative and treasurer of the Integrity Initiative. In 2014, he was awarded CFO of the Year by ING Bank Philippines and FINEX. He graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial Engineering from the University of the Philippines, Diliman in 1986 and completed the Shell Group Business Leadership Program at INSEAD, Singapore in 2005. He also holds accreditations for Certified Management Accountant and Professional Industrial Engineer. Mr. Pascual, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John. May I suggest that we kick off our reactions from our panelists, starting with Aztec Carlos, if you please.
Yes, thank you and good afternoon. And again, thank you very much for inviting NEDA in your conference. Again, I was so interested in the presentation of Malika. Thank you very much for the presentation, Malika. Very, very interesting. And I think it's quite useful. Although you did it for a different context, but I see its application, its usefulness even for the Philippines. I'll have two levels of response to the presentation of Malika. First is on the presentation on the energy transformation scenarios. And the second would be on foresight and scenario planning. And I guess the short-term scenarios that Malika presented are spot on. The wealth first, the health first, and the security first, which is the emerging short-term scenarios and the tensions, I think are spot on. Because basically, in managing this pandemic in the Philippines, basically these three tensions are very palpable, especially if you talk about the first two, the wealth first and the health first scenario. And again, in managing this pandemic, our arena would be the interagency task force. We see again sectors pushing for the health first, where they want to be more cautious, do longer lockdowns. Against again the economic managers saying that let's reopen the economy as soon as possible, do granular lockdowns. And I think even on the third aspect of security first, there's an advocacy now of again advocacy to revisit liberalization efforts and to reverse some of them. We need to make sure that we have our own vaccines. We need to make sure to make our own medicines. We need to make sure that because of the supply chain disruptions, we need to again do import substitution. So we see this very, very palpable, and I'm also very very interesting the way Malika was able to extend the short-term scenarios into three plausible long-term scenarios, which is the waves, Sky 1.5, and the islands. And again, extending this scenario in the context of energy transformation, I think that's basically a very, very good example of how you do scenario planning and foresight planning by extending these three plausible scenarios. I'm also very for me my main interest is really in terms of the action accelerators that Malika presented. And again, I think very important, whether or not it's for energy transformation or for other sectors, it's really alignment is very important, aligning policy, sectors, and the people. Again, smart policies, deregulation. And then third is really we need that leadership. And again, whether or not it's energy or the health sector or other sectors, I think these accelerators would be very, very important. And then what Malika did in terms of what is the implications of all of these three scenarios um, to Shell, were again having a target, or in my case, that's a vision of net zero emissions by 2050, and then looking at how Shell can do that within its three roles, um, and again the work plan for Shell. It was a complete presentation of basically um, using scenario building, foresight planning to use it for long-term planning in a corporation like Shell. So again, in terms of implications to the Philippines, I think it's very important that the Philippine government needs to enhance its role to align policies and sectors. The need for low carbon business models, particularly for oil and gas subsectors, to continue designing sustainable strategies for low carbon business models. And I think a good starting point to all of this is actually our National Action Plan for Sustainable Production and Consumption. It can be a good take-off point to initiate and accelerate decarbonization. So that's actually my take on the energy scenarios, the transformation. And on foresight planning, I have 2 minutes, very, very short. Again, Royal Dutch Shell is an example since 1970s doing foresight planning. And again, we have increasingly adapted foresight planning and futures thinking. A lot of companies have been doing that, and we are attempting in NEDA to actually adapt it and incorporate that in our different planning activities. I think since we've sort of extended our planning scenarios from the usual 6-year medium-term Philippine Development Plan to looking at 2040 as our long-term vision, and also committing to Agenda 2030 or the Sustainable Development Goals. So if your horizon goes longer, then again there's a bigger need to do again foresight planning, futures thinking, and scenario building. So again, we have started doing it, but again, what we've been doing for the past 3 years is building our capacities for strategy, for foresight planning, and again, so that when we do our successor Philippine Development Plan for 2023 to 2028, then we can use this in formulating across government. With that, thank you very much and good afternoon to all.
Thank you very much, Sir Carlo. Yeah, and thank you for sharing the possible dilemma, no, that there is a large possibility that different sectors of society will be trying to focus on one of those different short-term scenarios that Malika spoke about, and we will discuss more about that during the open forum. And because I'm aware as well, and you mentioned it earlier, that you have your own vision for 2040. Maybe later on we can talk about your ambition not in 2040, something that I think the NEDA did much earlier, I think around 5 or 6 years ago, and how it was affected by the pandemic. Now, let's now proceed to our next reactor. May I call on Mr. Chris Bashuri? Chris?
Hi. Yes, Chang, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Chang, for the invite, and Mike for the invitation. Malika, thanks for your conversation. I appreciate that. It's quite timely. We just came out of a 2-day strategy discussion for our power group. You would have fit right in because this is what we're talking about in terms of the pace of the energy transition. I guess this is what everybody is talking about. And if I step back and think for a moment just about the general technique or approach that you're using at Shell, and I have shamelessly borrowed from it. In fact, I spent a bit of time with Cesar Romero when I first joined Aboitiz to sort of get his thoughts about how does he do scenario planning, because some had been done here at Aboitiz, and I wanted to kind of compare what they were doing with how he thought about it. And so we gained a lot of insight from you and your group, and so appreciate that. And the way we've used it and thought about it is very much, trying to figure out what if. Obviously, we don't know which way the world is going to go, and the pace of the energy transition has enormous implication for our group. Obviously, not only for our economy, but certainly for our group. It affects how we think about our existing assets. It affects how we think about our new investments. And so, you could imagine a world where you're, accelerating into renewable energy, and suddenly discovering that the pace of technology is so fast that after your 3-year contracts run up, you're up against people who have a cost base that is now half yours. And so you're writing off an enormous investment, which if you were writing off thermal assets before you got into the RE is kind of a cascade of asset write-off, which for a private firm is never a very appetizing prospect. On the other hand, if you move too slow, you could find that you're not keeping up, and you're not growing, and you're not kind of playing to your natural ownership and strength. And so you could see a bit the challenge that we puzzle through, and that is literally what we're puzzling through right now. The part that we also add, though, and I think this brings me to this second point brings me to a third point. The part that we add, though, is also, I guess, what I would call a money metric, right? Or call it a returns metric, if you will, in the sense that we have to think about the different energy transition pathways that you have between your wealth and your sky and your islands. We have to think about the potential impact on the investments that we take and the value of the investments that we've already taken. And we have to incorporate that. And so, and that, goes from the general observations about where the world might go in terms of energy and the sources of energy and the consumption of energy. And it helps us, actually goes right to important questions about investments that we're making in the next, 2 to 3 years, right? Or divestments that we're making in the next 2 to 3 years. At the holding company where I sit, we actually, you might or might not know, we just brought in a partner from Japan who's bought about a quarter of our position in Aboitiz Power, in part to help fund the movement into new areas, and also to some extent to reduce our exposure to coal assets, right, at the holding company level. So all those questions are on the table. And I guess that brings me to the third point, which is really a tough one. And and I'm going to say things that are really familiar, but it's right in the front of my mind all the time, is you call it a wealth first, and then a sky 1.5. And I wouldn't, I'd if I could, I'd slightly reframe it from wealth first to development first, right? The challenge in a market economy like the Philippines is that if you're going to move toward renewable and it's more expensive, or it can't fulfill all the needs, say off peak, because it can't fulfill all the needs off peak, and you have to rely on thermal. If you're bringing in a higher cost of energy, that has a developmental impact. And when you're in an economy with 75% of the people who are, in a C class consumer or D class consumer, if not lower, and you're suddenly raising the costs of operation, which means you're affecting the attractiveness for investment in the country, which means you're affecting job creation, which means then you're affecting outcomes for people. And that is a real puzzle, honestly. I don't know, during the introduction, was it John graciously introduced me, and like you, when I hear that full biography, I kind of wonder who they're talking about. But I started in public policy. I spent 10 years in the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve, and that's kind of where I thought I would land. And I studied it, and I did it, and that's really my interest, which is in effective public policy. And here I really see this incredibly challenging and profound stress between what you might call health first and development first. Because poverty alleviation and economic development to me is as central as is obviously protecting the earth on which we're trying to do that development. And so, trying to balance those out, in a country like the Philippines, is to me an incredibly challenging proposition. So, it's like Santos. I mean, he's trying to figure out how do you, promote the movement and accelerate the transition, yet not leave the Philippines behind, because which maybe goes to your middle scenario, which you might call your islands first, which I wouldn't quite call it self-interest, but certainly security and security of your own people is going to matter, especially when you look at the Philippines, which has 18 gigawatts of total fleet capacity, in China, which has 250 gigawatts in development, right, for its economy. So you alter the composition here, you barely move the needle globally. So, I kind of have gone from, the scenarios and what we're thinking about every day to, the puzzle that sits for the Philippines in the broader context of a global picture. And, I really appreciate looking at the scenarios that you've painted, because you've obviously got a global picture. And I was interested to see that you had hydrogen in there as well. I'd love to have a side conversation, if you think, to know how that's going to come about, because that could really be a game changer. But anyway, I do appreciate, and I like what you said, and I just feel it triggers just as many questions for me, particularly when I sit in the Philippines, as when I think of myself as a global citizen. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And yeah, I think someone said that the best compliment for something that you're doing is to be copied. So I think that says something, Malika, about what Shell's doing. And then it's good that you recognize that there's a sort of a dilemma of sorts. Whether the scenarios themselves will result in the returns, or will the potential returns determine what kind of scenario you follow, and that's something that we need to think about, as well as what are the implications are for developing countries like the Philippines. So it's something that we can again go more deeper into during our open forum. May I invite our next panelist, Paulo Borromeo, to share his reactions.
Thank you, Jeng, and good afternoon, and thank you to FINEX for inviting me, and good afternoon or good morning, Malika, and thank you for the presentation. Good afternoon, Asek Kaloy and Chris. Nice to be part of this panel, Jeng. Thank you. First of all, just a big thank you to Malika for the presentation. I thought obviously well thought through process, and always a pleasure to hear from Shell on how they think about the future, and certainly a nice benchmark to hold. Maybe I'll switch a little bit, Jeng. I mean, we're as a group of companies, of course, we're very committed to sustainability, and the themes that Malika mentioned are very relevant to us. At Globe, I think we've already committed to a net zero goal, and planning is ongoing for the rest of our group as it relates to a bigger set of goals for us related to sustainability. But thank you, Malika, for setting the stage. But I think the heart of the presentation focused a lot around the planning framework too, and how Shell uses scenarios for its long-term planning. We are a 187-year-old firm, and so long-term planning is very important to us. As much as we would like to plan for the next 187 years, we've tried to regress a little bit and started, especially in this pandemic, to focus on shorter bits of time. No? And I'll talk a little bit more about that, Jeng. But someone once said that no other characteristic of decision making is as pervasive as uncertainty. And truly, in uncertainty, that's where you need to have all the tools at your disposal to help you in your decision making. So at Ayala, we of course do a lot of analysis at the planning level. But I just wanted to leave the group with a couple of thoughts, Jeng, in reaction to Malika's presentation. First, as a group of companies across many different industries, including power and the like, our sense is that the Philippines will recover to pre-pandemic levels by 2023 at the latest. No? And we're slightly more conservative than where we were earlier in the year. Initially, we thought the country would get back on track by 2022, but nonetheless, we're fairly optimistic that we will get there. But for planning purposes, my point is that we run the scenarios, but ultimately, as Chris mentioned, that we have to look at metrics or factors underpinning each of those scenarios. And of course, there are macroeconomic indicators, but we look to three key factors specifically for scenario planning, at least over the next 2 to 3 years. And it helps us assess the pace and the trajectory of the recovery, which ultimately helps us ensure that our businesses hopefully will be ready by the time the recovery takes shape. And I'll speak very briefly, Jeng, so we can go through the Q&A. But the first metric is the pace and the impact of our vaccination progress. As we vaccinate more individuals, we're hopeful that we'll begin to see improvements in the health situation and eventually more confidence overall from consumers and businesses alike. At the Ayala Group, we are probably 87% vaccinated across our 51,000 employees. And I believe most of the large groups here in the Philippines are at 80% or above already. But these are important metrics that we continue to track regionally, by city, by segment, so that we can get a sense of how we are doing relative to the overall health status. But that is the first metric that we track. The second metric is around mobility. And this ties in very closely with vaccination. But we look at various data sets to see where we are in terms of pre-pandemic levels, and whether we're beginning to see more mobility. But hopefully, as we eliminate the fear, we'll begin to see more and more people returning to work, safely finding ways for small gatherings, and eventually kids back to school. But we track this very closely. Unfortunately, we're still hovering at 75% of pre-COVID levels in terms of overall mobility and activity. I think it went down to about 30% at its lowest, 50% this year. But unfortunately, there's been a ceiling from the different trackers that we look at, of about 80% of pre-COVID levels. And I fear that this will not disappear until we fully vaccinate as many people as we can. The last factor that we look at are, of course, leading indicators of consumer demand. These include residential pre-sales, car sales, bank loans, everything that we have within our group. And we use this to track consumer sentiment and confidence. But to us, I guess my point being that metrics are very important. These three metrics are what we use for our own forecasting, for our own scenario planning. I will tell you that our forecasting, I've never seen larger deviations from budget forecasts, right, than we have. And so it begs the question of how useful it really is. And maybe later, Jeng, will talk more about some of the techniques that we've implemented in our planning process to try to minimize that deviation and try to be more precise in terms of our decision making, at least in the near term to the medium term. But thank you again to FINEX, and thank you to my co-panelists.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I'm very pleased to hear that your group Ayala is also embarking on a net zero campaign, and I think that's where we should be heading. And you talked about your planning process, and that maybe instead of summarizing what you said, that's something that we can kick off as part of the dialogue, the open forum that we have now, because I think a lot of our audience are not yet initiated into a lot of companies do strategic planning, but not very many might be doing scenario planning. And the question maybe is for Malika, because Shell has been doing this for 50 years, and then you look 50 years forward, and you would come up with, I'm saying we because I used to be familiar with it, but you will come up with multiple scenarios, and does that mean multiple strategies as well? What is the interplay between scenario planning and strategy? And you've already shown where or what scenario Shell wanted to pursue, and therefore needs to do the work now in order to get to that point. But maybe just from a process perspective, what is the relevance of scenario planning?
So yes, so I mean, as you said, I covered that, in terms of the trajectory from the scenarios to strategy, hopefully. But again, it's sort of it's a bit more of a messy process than, as you'd imagine, than the sort of very linear depiction. So I think it's all about understanding how the future could range. So what are the range of different outcomes you can have in that? And it's about thinking of a strategy that's resilient across those range of outcomes. So we might have a preferred, a scenario or outcome that we'd like to see, but it's understanding all the things that make that outcome or risk that outcome, and thinking about strategies that then, would help us to mitigate some of those risks. That's number one around these, use of scenarios. The other thing that I found, at least in I haven't been there for 50 years, but in my coming into the scenarios, there are a lot of commonalities, actually. You can see emerging commonalities and trends across the scenarios. So it's about, putting those together and saying, what are the opportunities that's creating? In all the three scenarios, you're going to have X, Y, or Z happen. So what can Shell do to take advantage of and create opportunities around that? So that's the other element of this aspect. So I think it's not different strategies for different scenarios, but understanding all the range of outcomes and then making sure we're either resilient or we're jumping on the opportunity that's going to be common across them.
All right. Thanks, Malika. And maybe for people who are considering going on to, scenario planning, what kind of organization do you have that actually supports that?
So we have a standing team, which has, as I said, been there for many years. And again, it looks at different elements of the energy system. So it's not just about energy supply. So I am part of the scenarios team as an economist. So we're looking at the economics of various different energy supply and demand. We have a geopolitics team. Energy is a highly politicized issue in a lot of countries. So again, the geopolitics of it, understanding what those drivers might be, as either as an accelerator or the inhibitor of what we're trying to do. And of course, we have a really large energy modeling team that looks and plays out these different outcomes. Now, this sits within group strategy. So again, we are doing that, bringing the outside in, but we are very much within group strategy, feeding those insights into the development of strategy. So again, it's not a straight line you can draw through it, but it's about bringing all those insights and giving the confidence through our expertise in the scenarios team to make sure that the strategy then is robust and all of this.
And then it's really the board itself that decides on which strategy to pursue?
That's right. It's the executive committee will be then looking and seeing what's, balancing the pros and cons, and then, obviously the board with oversight on that. So again, it's all like feeding up the right kind of inputs about what the future might look like. And then, of course, those decisions are not for me to make, but, our executive committee and board to make.
But you have a very strong recommendation for maybe a few of them, right?
Yeah, we have our views.
Right. Yes. Maybe I'll shift to ASEC Kaloy. Because we touched upon it earlier in your reaction. You mentioned that even within the NEDA, you have this 2040 ambition. Can you tell us more about that and how it evolved? And maybe, because it was developed 6 years ago, what kind of impact the pandemic had on whatever visioning process you had?
Well, actually, we did it in 2015. Basically, for the longest time, we do planning in a 6-year cycle, and that's basically the administration. But then we sort of got a lot of criticisms in terms of that's a very short time horizon. If you're looking at development and you want to look at change, then you should go beyond 6 years. And then so we did. We opted to do this exercise. And what we did is that we consulted the Filipino people. Basically, we did extensive FGDs, and the results of the FGDs, we went through we did a national representative survey to validate all of this. And basically, what it says is that this is the life that Filipinos want by 2040, which we call a matatag, maginhawa at panatag na buhay, which is strongly rooted, comfortable, and a secure future for all. So these are the aspirations of the Filipino people that we gathered from them. And what we did, we quantified this, costed it out to see, and then we did now technical studies if we can achieve this by 2040. And so we sort of now have milestones in achieving this, because if it's a 25-year time frame, then it will take 4 medium-term plans to be able to achieve that. And what we didn't call it a long-term plan. It's a long-term vision and a goal, because the plans would be, the strategies would be different. As long as the goals are clear and the targets are clear, then we leave the strategies to each of the administration to do it. Because the big risk is that a new administration come, they'll say that this plan is not ours. We'll ditch that. So we don't have a plan. We have a clear goal and vision of what Filipinos want, and who can argue with that. And then so that for each of the administration coming in, then they can make their own strategy. Unfortunately, this pandemic has really, it's really a curveball for us. And again, when we did our last review, it will take 4 to 5 more years to achieve that ambition. So it's not going to happen in 2040 because of the pandemic. So what's important now is that, again, what are now the policies, the plans, the catch up that you have to do, so that we go back into the trajectory. If not, it's not going to be ambitious in 2040. It's going to be ambitious in 2045. And so
right.
Again, that pandemic, what we did first with the pandemic is that we updated our medium-term plan. That's the first thing that we did. In the remaining 2 years, what can be done? Then we're now looking into how do we now address the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's 2030. And the next is that we will look at again the ambition in 2040. We might conduct a reassessment. We might go back to the Filipino people and ask them again, is this still your ambition? So then we can make the alignment. So again, among others, even among planners, I think the pandemic has had that impact among planners like us.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kaloy. And maybe going to that point that you raised about impact, I was going to ask our other gentlemen about their processes in their respective companies, but I think they've already touched upon that in their reaction. So maybe let's talk about impact. And going back to Malika, we are approaching the 19th month of the pandemic, or since the pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization, and within that time span, and I think as Kaloy already mentioned, at least locally there's some sort of tension between the wealth first and health first. Globally, what do you see as the main trend on these lines, Malika?
Yeah, so once we do the scenarios, we keep track of signals and signposts, as we call it, to see which direction are you going in. And so we have been watching post-pandemic, what's the world, which direction it's going in. Again, quite a lot of variability, so as you'd imagine. As country circumstances are different, they prioritize different elements of health, wealth, and security. By and large, we're seeing wealth being a dominant consideration. So I think the economic impacts of the COVID are really sort of extreme, and that sort of made governments prioritize just reopening the economy to get livelihoods back, to get people back into work, and also to prevent long-term damage to the economy by sort of through lockdowns. So I think we're seeing a lot of that in most of the countries. With some countries, and like Germany and the European Union, we are seeing a little bit more of a push towards health. So again, a lot more caution in terms of reopening, but also a lot of focus on the recovery packages on green. So there's a lot of, the recovery packages are provided, but with caveats to make it more sustainable and to drive those sort of behaviors. But we're also seeing some countries sort of retreating and sort of having strategies with just security first, which is all about sort of, looking inward, closing borders as a way of addressing the pandemic, not sort of as a sort of anti-globalization, but it's just that sort of sort of consideration is also coming in. So I think it's a mixed bag. But again, we do see a lot of, particularly the OECD developing countries, a bit of a focus also on the green. So using this as an opportunity to recover in a way that's more sustainable.
Yes, thanks. And then maybe help clarify for me, because earlier you were saying that, the short-term scenarios lead to the longer-term scenarios. Wealth first becomes waves, security first becomes islands, health first becomes sky. But given this difference, these differences in approach, is it possible that they will sort of consolidate into one desirable long-term scenario?
So, I mean, if you look at what we have today, we're not on a Sky 1.5 trajectory. So just globally, we're not on that. And so again, it's a challenge to think about how do you, in this very testing pandemic context, start driving those alignments and focus on green. So I think that's sort of a bit of a reality check on all of this when we're looking at these scenarios. But I think what we are seeing is that, well, that there is an early wave. So let me sort of add an additional wrinkle here, that it's a waves kind of outlook, but it's sort of, but it's bringing the sort of the decarbonization is happening in a more disorderly way, which is what we have in waves, but it's starting to happen sooner than we had imagined in waves. So we're seeing in waves, we assumed it like late 2030s, there would be this backlash and pressure to go green. But what we're seeing here is that it's the same disorderly and wealth first kind of recovery, but a backlash already building from society, from other aspects, climate impacts. We've seen this summer in Europe has been quite challenging. So you're seeing that backlash build up a little bit sooner. So I think we're almost like in early waves. Disorderly, it's not as orderly as Sky, but it's also quicker than waves. So that's the best I can say.
Thanks, Malika. Going back to Asek Kaloy and using the same question, what are you? I mean, I think you said earlier that there's this tension locally on health versus health. Is that how you are seeing the Philippines in terms of the way that Malika or Shell characterizes, the scenarios moving forward? And if so, what can the NEDA do given its ambition 2040?
I guess it's in the short term, I suppose. But again, translating those short term tensions into plausible scenarios, I think you have to take it in a sectoral context. So then so basically I think that's palpable currently, and it's all over the place. You all know that with again trying to address again response and recovery for the pandemic. I think moving forward, I think it's important that again it's important to basically make sure that again we do plans, we do the planning, especially I think in the next Philippine Development Plan, because that's actually where you would look at resiliency, recovery and resiliency. So the theme right now, we're still at a response stage, right? So again, it's not. That's why we also have to look at a different framework and different NDRIMC framework, because the usual if it's a disaster, then you need response, which is short, and then you need to do a assessment of the damages, and then you have to go into recovery. So that's a very short, the transition of response and damage assessment is very short. But here, it's like a response for almost 2 years. At the same time, trying to do recovery. At the same time, trying to build resilience. So it's actually totally different. So I guess that's it. We would we actually would have to actually define it in the longer term. It depends on the context and probably on the sector.
Yeah, and I think that the NEDA is in a very good position to actually make the case on how to move forward, because you have the data, you have all of the economic statistics. I mean, I think the same way that the Shell scenarios team was able to develop its scenarios and even say that if you do this, you're going to hit 2.5 degrees to 1.5. I think that's where
Yes.
your power, so to speak, is.
And I think that's also important because we actually did already a sort of an assessment over the next 40 years, a net present value of the cost of COVID to the Philippines, looking at everything. And then that's actually a part now of how we push to sort of do the balancing more in terms of trying to sort of reopen the economy and be more manage risks, not being risk averse, but managing risk.
Right. Thanks. Maybe going to Paulo. You have a very unique and interesting role in Ayala because you have oversight on health. At the same time, you look after the strategy for the whole group. So what kind of insights did you get or perspective on how the pandemic impact on health affected your strategy within Ayala?
Well, I think it impacted everyone's strategy, Jeng. But for us, speaking about long-term plans, we had long-term plans, all documented and everything. When the pandemic hit, we literally threw it all out the window. I mean, literally, 2025 plans, 2030 plans out the window. And I think what we've done since then was move to sort of a dual planning mindset. And I encourage everyone to think about it. Now, one, as Asik Kaloy said, one has to have an eye towards a long-term vision. And so I think that's still very important, that we have an eye towards a long-term vision, whether it be 2025, 2030, 2040, that we have an ambition to where we want to be as a group and or as an institution, and let that drive us. But in parallel, I think we've learned that you also need to really be more nimble and be more flexible with the specific, more near-term plans that you have. And I just wanted to emphasize that all of what we do, and I've been in strategic planning for 15 years, all the planning that we do, all the scenario analysis, all the other types of quantitative analysis that we do, the end goal is really decision making, right? And so we need to be able to use indicators, factors, metrics, etc., to aid us in decisions. And I think if there's anything that we've learned, it's so uncertain, right? The next 2-3 years are so uncertain. But we as a group have committed to certain what we call no regret moves. And as with any scenario planning, I'm sure Malika, Shell, you do this too. What are your no regret moves? And, despite what I said earlier about, your views, our views on vaccination, our views on mobility, our views on consumer, I think we as a group have committed to certain no regret moves. And I encourage all of the other organizations to also think about it that way. But clearly, I think we have a unique visibility into the healthcare sector and then how we are doing as a country relative to the crisis. That helps us in our planning. It doesn't give us any advantage, right? Because all of us are still living through uncertainty. And I think in this environment, we just all have to be very nimble and very flexible with our planning cycles. And make sure that it aids us in decision making, especially for the near to mid term. Thanks, Jang.
Yeah. Thanks, Paolo. And yeah, indeed, we are in a period of uncertainty. I think Shell's global CEO called it a crisis of uncertainty last year. And going to uncertainties, Chris, your group, Aboitis, is invested in various industries, ranging from power, banking and finance, food, construction, infrastructure, land, and we know that there are winners and losers in these various industries as a result of the pandemic. So, how did you approach your strategies and plans, given the diverse impacts on the different industry sectors because of these current uncertainties?
Well, I think just like all of you and as Paulo you articulated, all of our plans basically came to a screeching halt. I remember we go through we call strategy dialogue throughout the entire year, that beginning in January, and not as a planning, but as a dialogue where we set up different topics, we get people in a room, we have these conversations, try to get people to lift their heads. One of the comments I made to Monchuo Boy just when I first joined was I really felt that there was a great amount of talent in the group, but that everybody was sort of, forgive me, head down and butt up, focusing on operations. They weren't really thinking about the horizon. And so we started this dialogue that really goes, throughout the entire year. And so, and we had presented, we were just kind of bringing in some initial thoughts very early in 2020. And I think it was March 24th. And that turned out, and this was after a bunch of ideas had been accumulated. And it was about a week after the first lockdown in Manila in the Philippines. So, Jang, we basically had to, basically throw that to the side, focus on kind of, cash preservation. We were near inking a couple of transactions. We had to pull back from that. But we did it I guess there were really three things that kind of sort of started rolling forward. One was the very close kind of constant regular checking on where we were financially and ensuring that that things were sound and protecting all of that. Number two was we actually put in place something we didn't have before, which was a estimation really of what we thought the pace of recovery and the path of economic recovery might be. Again, a total scenario planning exercise. Obviously, I think as we all know now, but took us some time to discover then. It really all turned on confidence, which all turned on the discovery and distribution of vaccines. But we started to get in place some ideas. We were pleasantly surprised at our ability to kind of get close to what the actual outcomes were turning out to be economically. So that helped us a great deal. And we anchored more of our planning in those views on the economic recovery. And then we had kind of what we called fast action teams, where we were picking up individual businesses, focusing on specific areas where we felt we either needed to pull back or we felt we could continue to push forward. Because you'll see, I mean, you pick in any industry, and there are going to be those who continue to press forward and do well, and there are going to be those who are going to struggle. And you'll find that whether times are good or bad. So it wasn't as though we felt that there wasn't anything that we could be doing and continuing to press forward on. We just had to be, very, very sort of granular in our, assessments. And we were, I guess, to borrow the phrase from financial market types, risk off, right? We had to really be super careful and have much higher levels of confidence, take fewer bets and fewer risky bets than we had been contemplating before that. I'm picking my words really carefully because I know Paulo's here and listening, so I don't want to give away anything. But yeah, I mean, it's for all of us. I know I'm speaking nothing new for any of us. It was a super challenging, stressful, and exhausting period. And I wouldn't say was, because it still remains quite arduous. But yeah, it was. And frankly, honestly, it made us a heck of a lot stronger and a heck of a lot sharper on the choices that we make.
All right. Thanks, Chris. I think all companies experience that, and even when I was in Pilipinas Shell last year, that reset of strategies was also quite quite evident. We needed to do that because we knew that we wouldn't be making whatever we committed previously to our investors. Let's move on from looking at the past, the impact of the pandemic, to something more forward-looking, the future, and focusing really on Malika's presentation on and its impact on sustainability, the climate change. I think most of you heard on the news last night that 3 scientists won the Nobel Prize for Physics for together, their works together resulted in the conclusion that man does have an impact on climate change. And with Shell having acknowledged climate change, I think for decades past, as far as I was aware, it's important for us maybe to start looking at those what these future scenarios will lead to in terms of sustainability. And Malika, you mentioned that whether it's economic growth, primary energy demand, energy transition itself, and the impact on climate change, they follow different trajectories for each scenario. But you also talked about the sort of the preference for sky and about the need for action accelerators and the collaboration. So, having with you being on various councils, getting involved with decision makers, what do you think are the main obstacles to collaboration and decarbonization eventually?
So yes, I did notice the Nobel news yesterday, and I've been working in this for a few years, many years now, so it wasn't news to me, but I'm glad that there was recognition of their work through the Nobel Prize. So that was a good outcome. I think you're right. It's now about putting that discussion to bed and looking at what do you do now to what actions do you take to start addressing these issues. And collaboration is key. A couple of aspects, if I might draw out. Firstly, particularly from a Shell perspective, firstly, it's collaboration with other players in our value chain. So we provide energy supply, but there's no point creating a lot of low carbon supply if that's not actually being used. The demand side hasn't evolved enough to take on that low carbon supply. So a lot of times it's working with our customers in that sector, whether it's road transport or whether it's heavy industry, to help them also invest simultaneously with us in scaling up demand. So creating those markets for this low carbon supply. So that's one element of collaboration that's quite different from before. It's not a joint venture. It's not sort of working in that way. It's working much more in a knitting together incentives way. The second aspect that I think is key is with policymakers. Really, a lot of this our strategies and the progress in the transition will require policy to change, to support, firstly, level the playing field, as I said before, between fossil and non-fossil, and then actively support some of these technologies to become commercial, like hydrogen. We've seen sort of renewables becoming the cost declines we've seen is eye-watering. And that's because there has been that policy push that has then encouraged businesses to invest and innovate. So I think, again, working with governments to see what are the kinds of policy measures that will accelerate action, I think becomes and again, it's not about looking backwards and saying, what policies have you done? And so what can you do? It's looking forward and saying, what are the kinds of proactive policies that you need to put in? And having that discussion with government, again, quite different from how, we've operated as Shell in a market that's really market driven. Oil markets are global, so are gas markets. So you don't have that much interaction with policymakers, but that has to change with sort of intimate interaction with policymakers to hit their objectives as policymakers to be more sustainable, as well as our objectives to become net zero emissions.
Yes, and then maybe, I don't know what your take is, because as we were discussing earlier with ASEC Kaloy, they were able to establish a vision that was generated by the stakeholders themselves. How important is this in getting those policy changes into place?
So that's another key aspect we haven't picked up on this so much. It's about the just transition, so what we call the fair and equitable transition. So this is all about providing something that's better than before, because otherwise, what is the reason for society to get behind this? So I think making progress at pace means you have to have society and citizens understanding what that change is and how they will benefit from it. So I think to me that's another absolutely key element, which maybe we didn't touch on in this group, but we think a lot about.
Right. Asek Kaloy, I think just on sustainability, the Philippines submitted its national determined contributions to climate change earlier this year. And if you look at it in terms of the 2040 ambition, Filipinos are saying that they want to be secure and free from these effects of climate change like floods, typhoons, etc. So, what is currently the thinking of NEDA in making in pursuing this track that the Philippines actually makes good on its contribution to combating
Yes.
climate change?
Well, NEDA actively participated in the development of the country's first NDC. We made sure that our NDC commitment is aligned with Ambition Natin 2040, and I think it's very important the balancing aspect and looking at can you basically we need to triple per capita income by 2040 from 2015. So then if you're tripling per capita income, and again you need power, you need electricity, you need all of these things. Can you be able to do that, but at the same time protecting the environment? So basically we actually looked at that NDC in this context. And undoubtedly climate change will make it more challenging for us to realize ambition. And I think when we updated, as I said, we updated the medium-term plan, then we will revisit the Sustainable Development Goals and then revisit Ambition Natin 2040. When we revisited the Philippine Development Plan, I think we basically looked at resilience and health. It's a healthy and resilient Philippines as the theme. And looking at almost all of the chapter of the plans, 15 out of the 22 chapter of the Philippine Development Plan have some green recovery strategies in the different sectors. So it's not only in the chapter of environment and energy that you're looking at green recovery, but you're embedding them in all of these chapters, because we need to address multidimensional risks arising from climate change and other hazard events, including implications on the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So basically we are consciously looking at, again, resilience and green recovery in updating and the Philippine development plans. And again, as I said later on, when we also do the same for our SDG commitments, and also when we would again review Ambition Natin 2040.
Thanks a lot, Asek Kaloy. Maybe going to our colleagues in business, maybe starting off with Chris. Your energy business is described as the right mix portfolio of renewable and thermal sources. With the developments that we've spoken about here and the NDC, and the anticipated increase in demand in energy that Malika spoke about. How does it shape your future energy portfolio?
Well, we definitely have set out that aspiration of a 50-50 mix by 2031. That's what we're aiming at. In fact, it's slightly, 50. Thermal would be less than 50% if we have our way. And there's a variety of pushes within the country to try to help bring that about. There's the renewable portfolio standards, which sort of push the country toward RE, and we all know that RE costs, renewable energy costs, have fallen to be at parity, at least when they're operating. So that's good news, and so we think that's right, and that's where we're focusing our attention. We come back to the conversations that we've had here the last 2 days within our group, and the conversation we're having here with FINEX, and is really more the uncertainty around it, right? I think honestly the toughest puzzle is when you look at the price path of technology, or I should say the technology development path and the associated capital costs. You know, it's Malika, you said something a little bit earlier, and I made a note to myself. You're pointing yourself at the fundamental tension, which is we have to make in power long-term capital commitments, yet the amount of reciprocal commitment could be really short-term, and you could find things shifting so fast that you put a lot of investment in place, and then suddenly discover that you can't win any kind of reasonable return. Now, what does that do? That kind of makes you hesitant to invest again, both because you just lost a lot, but also because you have a different kind of risk profile of what you're looking at. So, Jang, it's a really tough puzzle, but we know what we're aiming at. And I think, Malika, you said it, and I think Paulo, you said it, and Isaac, you said it, is you kind of have to keep yourself constantly attentive to the signposts and the milestones, get a sense of where you think things are going, develop your own what we call in-house view or house view of some of these things that are going to impact the choices that we make. And at some point, you just have to make a commitment, right? And that commitment might be, I'm going to step back for a while until I see how it plays out. Or you make a commitment and say, okay, I know what I'm after and I know what I'm facing. But so, Jen, that's not a very definitive answer, but frankly, that's decision making under uncertainty, and that's right. The heart of what we're contending with. So,
thanks a lot, Chris.
Answers your question.
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you very much. And maybe Paulo, I was looking at your website, and a couple of things struck me, and that your focus on transformation. And when you say transformation, it's a means towards meeting the evolving needs of Filipinos for sustainable communities, and as well as other basic needs and services. So what I mean, having heard what Asek Kaloy said about aspiration for the future, that the Filipinos' own vision for their future, how do you see your transformation journey dovetailing with this?
Well, no, I think we subscribe a lot to what the NEDA has put in place, Jeng, and Ambition Natin 2040 is a product of a lot of work and consultation with different stakeholders. So we're very, very supportive of it. And I don't think anyone will disagree that we all have to work together to uplift per capita incomes and household incomes to ensure that we're preparing for the future. So I think on our side, we've always made commitments, a strong commitment towards what we call social infrastructure. And so in terms of transformation, I think we've invested in healthcare and in education. These are very much, Asek Kaloy, if I'm correct, in line with the nation's long-term ambitions. And we strongly believe that providing quality healthcare and delivering relevant education helps form the foundation of a productive and healthy society. So our challenge in these sectors is to constantly rethink the traditional business models, especially now with the pandemic, and to leverage new tools as needed. But of course, healthcare to me is my own personal passion project, and it's something that we're extremely committed to. Education is also an industry that we're extremely committed to. But in both of these cases, it requires a lot more transformation, as you said, Jeng, especially if it were to survive through the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. And we should be looking forward to these transformations as it impacts our countrymen. I think we're basically running out of time. I just have a couple of questions that I'm picking out from the question box in the chat. So let me just go through it, through these. So the first question is for you, Chris. And it's a yes or no question. Are you able to share more about your plans for diversification that you mentioned stemming from your recent sale of AP?
I'll turn off my speakers, Chris.
Well, in that case,
answer yes or no first, and then we will respect.
If Paulo's not listening, yes.
Okay, then let's move on to the next question. It's not addressed to anyone. It's raised by one of our past presidents, Fred Parungao. Considering the lessons that we have learned on the pandemic, which caught everyone off guard in their business planning and preparedness, what basic changes should countries and companies do to better prepare us for the next unforeseen major catastrophe that could befall us? Uh, Maybe I think it's looking at it from a global perspective. So maybe Malika, you want to take a crack at answering this question? How can we be more prepared for the next, global crisis or pandemic?
So I think so. Yeah. So that's a tough one. It's a big question. Let me put it this way: that inevitably there will be disruptions. So if you're looking at the next 30, 40 years, the disruptions of one form or the other will be inevitable. So the question is, how do you make sure that you're resilient to that, and no matter where it's coming from? So you build in that sort of flexibility into strategies. You build in the ability to pivot and respond, when things happen. To the extent that you can think out and see what the potential disruptions could be in the specific field you're in. For example, we are in the energy field, so we're looking out at what the energy markets might be doing, and then anticipating those, then preparing for that eventuality, and having plans, I think, becomes absolutely key. And then obviously, being Shell, the scenarios approach is what you need, really. And I think the world is now catching up with that. The fact that we are in an era of uncertainty. Forecasts don't give you that much information. So how do you get your arms around it? Doing these sort of scenarios exercises, playing out what you think even are unlikely things, to widen mindsets and sort of be prepared to respond in a nimble way, I think becomes absolutely central.
Thank you, Malika. Would the other gentlemen have any comments on that? No? All right, then maybe because I'm just conscious of time, maybe let's just do one, a wrap up. And may I request sort of parting messages on our theme of, a glimpse into the future, planning for the present from each one of you. So may I start with Asek Kaloy?
Well, you basically, I think the term, no, you're looking at the future, but in the present, it's really what planning is all about. But again, as Malika mentioned earlier, it has using the term VUCA, the volatility, the uncertainty,
Complexity.
and ambiguity. Basically, you're saying now that it's not what you're looking at planning before, is that where you want to be and how to get there. And that's not a line. That's not even a circuitous line. And there are many lines there. And I think this has made us to basically look at other methodologies to do plans. And again, before you're doing strategic planning, but again, it's difficult to do that for a longer term because strategies change, and you have to be resilient. So then we need to actually look at other methodologies to plan better.
All right, thank you, Asek Kaloy. Chris, last message.
Well, let me slightly dodge your question by just telling you something that I tell my teams a lot, which is, I think back to microeconomics classes where your professor would draw a supply and demand curve, and then the professor would draw a new supply curve and say, well, you move from this equilibrium to that equilibrium, and we'd all dutifully take our notes and say, wow, that was a interesting move, and it looks neat and tidy. The problem is we're right in the middle of the equilibrium. I'm moving from one equilibrium to the next, and they're never neat and tidy. And this one is particularly tumultuous. And then you throw COVID on top of it, and it's even more unpredictable, which is why the whole scenario planning is so important. Scenario planning, or just kind of thinking about different outcomes, right? It's just incredibly useful and important because you can then see potential outcomes of the future. I honestly don't know, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, I honestly don't know if they ever converge, right? You could have really wildly different outcomes, which makes it so difficult. I mean, your baseline strategy might actually have 3 or 4 very contradictory moves because they act as hedges against each other. So I guess I'd say that, it's just as much kind of creating optionality that allows you to follow the course of, the outcomes because you can't really shape them entirely. And that's about, to me, the most robust way that we can go about it. And that's really how we're trying to go about it within Aboitiz.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Paolo?
Well, first of all, thank you to FINEX again, and Michael and Jeng and everyone for having us. I just leave everyone with a thought of this period of uncertainty. I've been watching a lot of World War II movies lately, Chris. And it's funny, right? When you're back in the day, if you were in part of World War II and it was 1940, 1941, I mean, you were trying to predict when will this thing ever end, right? And you don't really know, right? And I mean, even as much as we'd like to think forward and put forward a base case, and we have, there's still a lot of things that we don't know. And so I think for us as financial executives, as business executives, I think the most important lesson is that we learn to roll with the punches and be as flexible as possible. Someone once said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Right? A little hard to do these days, but you still can, right? And so from what I said earlier, vaccinations are important, mobility is important, consumer demand is important. And so to the extent that our organizations can be part of the solution to those 3 things, then we're helping at least create the future by encouraging more vaccinations, encouraging more mobility, and encouraging more consumer demand, right? So I leave that for the audience to Jeng, and again, thank you to FINEX.
Thank you, Paolo. And to the rose among us thorns, and with the right color at that, Malika?
Yes. So I think the one thing I would leave, the message I would leave with is that sometimes when you talk about this sort of transformation, it feels like it's happening somewhere else. It feels overwhelming, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're a business, or whether you're a consumer. And I think the key is that each of us in our roles has agency and has choices, not only to change how we are behaving, but also to change around us. Those who are around us, whether that's policies or whether that's business strategies or whether that's through consumer choice. And I think that's what we need, is that ecosystem of change feeding off each other to drive and accelerate action, rather than thinking of it as a top-down system change and then sort of feeling overwhelmed by saying, well, I'm just a small part of that system. What do I do to make that change? So I think that's what I would leave, that this is for all parts of society to sort of pull together and make change happen within our own areas of influence. And then that will then create that momentum to drive the system-wide change.
Well, thank you very much, Malika. And once again, thank you very much to our distinguished speaker and panelists for the fascinating and the insightful discussions on how scenarios play an important role in providing us glimpses into possible future realities that would help validate the visions and strategies we set today. Ladies and gentlemen, our esteemed speaker and guests represent organizations that are centenarians, organizations that have been in existence for over a century. As businesses, Shell, Aboitiz, Ayala would not have gotten this far without clear long-term visions and strategies. But the world is becoming more uncertain, and strategic plans are typically straight-line graphs of current trends built upon certain assumptions carried into the future. And I think most of us are familiar with the hockey stick charts, right? Certain planning, scenario planning is a process or tool that helps improve strategic agility. It takes into account various qualitative social conditions or changes that affect the doability of strategies. Preparing multiple credible what-if scenarios, as Chris mentioned earlier, and corresponding consistent strategies offers organizations that resilience and toughness to weather the tough times. But it does not end there. Scenario planning also raises key issues and opportunities, which Malika called action accelerators, that if addressed and collaborated upon by all concerned stakeholders, including government, and we're thankful that as Kaloy is here, would propel business and society towards the more compelling future reality. I hope you all found this afternoon session as insightful and compelling as I have. Thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you join us for the rest of this week's events. May I now turn you over back to John.
All right, what a very interesting and engaging conversation. We would like to thank our speaker, Ms. Malika Ishwaran, and to our panelists, Asek Kaloy Abad Santos, Mr. Krish Bishuri, and Mr. Paulo Borromeo. We'd also like to thank our moderator, Mr. Jen Pascual, for expertly moderating the panel discussion. At this point, we'd also like to thank our sponsors for this year's conference, who made these series of webinars and activities possible. Our partners, Divina Law, LT Group of Companies, and Union Bank of the Philippines. Our platinum sponsors, Aboitiz Equity Ventures Inc., Alliance Global Group Inc., First Philippine Holdings Corporation, NOAA Business Applications, Robinson's Land Corporation, United Auctioneers Inc., and Vista Land and Lifescapes Inc. Our diamond sponsors, All Day Supermarket, All Home, Ayala Land Inc., Meralco, and Reyes Candong and Company. Our knowledge partner, KPMG, RG Manabat and Company. Our gold sponsors, Accra Law, Bank of the Philippine Islands, Cirtec Holdings Philippines Corporation, Converge ICT Solutions Inc., Navarro Ampere and Company, Deloitte Philippines, Philinvest Development Corporation, FTI Consulting Philippines Inc., Metrobank, Monde Nissan Corporation, P&A Grant Thornton, RCBC, San Miguel Corporation, Filipinas Shell Petroleum Corporation, and SGB and Company. Our patron sponsors, BDO Unibank Inc., Mega World, Philippine National Bank, Security Bank, Wilcon Depot, and East West Bank. Our official broadcast partner, ABS-CBN News Channel, and our print media partners, Business Mirror, Business World, The Manila Times, and The Daily Tribune. We would also like to thank everyone for attending today's session of the FINEX Week Conference. We hope that you will continue to participate in the rest of our webinars this week. This has been your webinar host, John Balse of FTI Consulting Philippines. Thank you, everyone. God bless, keep safe and healthy.
Thank you very much.